I had been feeling a bit under the weather and decided to take a quick trip to the local Walmart to pick up some medicine and groceries. It was a regular Sunday afternoon, and the store was full of families, students from James Madison University, and locals doing their weekly shopping. As I pushed my cart through the aisles, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced around but didn't see anything out of the ordinary, just a busy store full of people. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my mild fever and fatigue. I headed to the pharmacy section to grab some cold medicine. As I reached for a bottle of NyQuil, I noticed a man standing a few feet away, staring at me. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and wearing a faded baseball cap. Our eyes met, and he quickly looked away, pretending to browse the vitamins. It really creeped me out, but I brushed it off as paranoia. I continued shopping, picking up some bread, milk, and a few other essentials. Every time I turned a corner, there he was, lurking a few steps behind. I tried to lose him by zigzagging through the aisles, but he always seemed to reappear. At this point, I was starting to freak out a bit. By the time I reached the checkout line, I was on high alert. I discreetly glanced over my shoulder and saw him standing near the electronics section, pretending to look at a display of headphones. I quickly paid for my items and headed for the exit, hoping to lose him in the parking lot. As I walked to my car, I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking. I could feel his presence behind me, getting closer with each step. I finally reached my car, unlocked the door, and threw my groceries in as fast as I could. I looked around quickly, and then I saw him standing about 10 feet away, staring intently.
"Hey, can I talk to you for a second?"
He called out, taking a step closer. I didn't respond. Instead, I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. I was in full panic mode. I quickly backed out of the parking space and sped towards the exit. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw him standing there, watching me leave. The fear didn't subside, even as I put more distance between us. I drove straight to a nearby Starbucks and parked in a well-lit area, trying to calm myself down. I called my best friend Sarah and told her what had happened. "That's terrifying," she said. "You need to report this to the police." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I know. I will. I just need to calm down first." I sat in my car for a while, taking slow, deep breaths. The fear slowly gave way to anger. How dare he make me feel so unsafe in a place I went to regularly? I decided to drive to the Harrisonburg Police Department and file a report. At the station, the officers were sympathetic and took my statement seriously. They assured me they would review the security footage from Walmart. Despite their reassurances, I still felt a lingering fear. A week later, I received a call from the police. They had identified the man from the Walmart security footage. He was a local homeless man with a history of harassment. They had picked him up for questioning and said that he had no real intentions of harming me, just a weird fascination. I found that both odd and concerning. The news brought some relief, but the experience had left a lasting impact. I made a conscious effort to be more aware of my surroundings and to trust my instincts. If something felt off, it probably was. And while the incident at Walmart was behind me, the lesson it taught me would stay with me forever. Let me tell you about this horrifying experience I had a while back. I'm a photographer and always looking for those offbeat, spooky places to get some cool shots. One day, I decided to go on a little adventure into the woods. There's this spot I've been eyeing for a while, an old schoolhouse, long abandoned. I'd heard talk about it, mostly from other photographers and urban explorers, and I couldn't resist the urge any longer. The schoolhouse is deep in the woods, far enough off the beaten path that you wouldn't just stumble across it by accident. You've got to know it's there, which I did. It was one of those crisp autumn days, the kind where the leaves crunch under your feet and the air is just cold enough to see your breath. I parked my car at the edge of the forest, slung my camera bag over my shoulder, and started hiking. It wasn't a marked trail or anything, so I just had to follow some vague directions I'd pieced together from various sources. About 30 minutes into my hike, I started to wonder if I was going to find the place. I was definitely having doubts about the directions I had pieced together. Eventually, I saw it through the trees. The schoolhouse stood in a small clearing, its once white paint now chipped and peeling, the windows shattered or boarded up. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie, and I couldn't wait to get inside and start shooting. The door was hanging off its hinges, creaking softly in the breeze. I pushed it open with a loud groan, stepping into the dim interior. The smell hit me first, musty, damp, and slightly metallic like blood or old pennies. Dust particles floated in the light filtering through the broken windows, and the floorboards creaked ominously under my weight. I started snapping pictures, the click of my camera echoing through the empty halls. The classrooms were still filled with old desks, some overturned, others just abandoned in place. A few chalkboards had faded lessons still scrawled on them, barely legible after all these years. It was eerie, like the kids and teachers had just up and left one day, never to return. As I wandered through the schoolhouse, I found myself drawn to what looked like the basement entrance. The door to the basement was slightly open, and a narrow staircase led down into the darkness. I flicked on my flashlight and descended, each step creaking loudly in the silence. The basement was even creepier than the main floor. It was filled with old equipment, rusted and decaying, and the walls were lined with shelves holding all sorts of oddities, jars of preserved specimens, old textbooks, and other random artifacts. I took a few pictures, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone down there. That's when I heard it. A soft, faint thump, like something falling to the ground in the distance. I swung my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The thumps grew louder, though, echoing off the walls like someone was trying to get my attention. Those noises were freaking me out, and I decided I'd had enough of the basement. As I turned to head back upstairs, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A door at the far end of the room, partially hidden behind a stack of old crates. It was different from the other doors. It looked newer, like it had been added after the school was abandoned. Curiosity got the better of me, and I made my way over to the door. It was locked, of course, but the wood was old and brittle. With a few hard kicks, it splintered open. Beyond the door was another staircase, this one leading even deeper underground. The air was colder here, and the faint thumps had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. I hesitated for a moment, but my need to explore kept driving me. I went down the stairs, and at the bottom I found myself in a long, narrow hallway. The walls were lined with old lockers, their doors hanging open or missing entirely. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed that the air was getting colder and the silence was becoming almost deafening. My flashlight's beam seemed to barely light the area up. I started to feel genuinely scared, but I pushed on, driven by some morbid curiosity. At the end of the hallway, I found another door. This one was different. It looked more like a vault door, metal and heavy. There was no lock that I could see, just a large handle. I took a deep breath and turned the handle, half expecting it to be stuck, but it moved easily, the door swinging open with a low groan. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. It was a large room, much larger than I would have expected. The walls were lined with old medical equipment, rusted gurneys, shelves filled with dusty bottles, and strange, archaic instruments I couldn't even begin to identify. In the center of the room were several operating tables, each one stained and rusted. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what looked like figures lying on the tables. They were covered with old, deteriorated sheets, but I could see the outlines of their skeletal bodies beneath. I knew, somehow, that they weren't just mannequins or props. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, but something kept me rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on the scene before me. That's when I heard the faint thumps again, louder this time, but more erratic. I was frozen in terror, but eventually I forced myself to move. I backed out of the room, and the door slammed shut behind me with a loud bang, and the thumping noise stopped abruptly, leaving me in eerie silence. I stumbled back down the hallway, completely freaked out at this point. I needed to get out of there, and fast. But the schoolhouse seemed to have other plans. As I reached the top of the stairs, I realized with growing horror that the basement door was no longer open. It was closed tight, and no amount of pushing or pulling would budge it. Panic set in. I was trapped. I was quickly trying to figure out how to escape. I ran back downstairs and was frantically looking for another way out. That's when I noticed another door, one I hadn't seen before. It was slightly ajar, and with no other options, I made my way over and pushed it open. The room was small and cramped, filled with old filing cabinets and stacks of yellowed papers. I could see another door on the far side, and I made my way towards it, hoping it would lead to my escape. But as I crossed the room, I felt a cold hand grip my ankle. I looked down, and to my horror, saw a pale, creepy, ghostly figure emerging from beneath one of the filing cabinets. Its eyes were hollow, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. I kicked my leg, breaking free of its grasp, and stumbled towards the door. I was in a full-fledged panic and could barely breathe at this point. I burst through the door and found that it led outside to the back of the school. Without hesitation, I sprinted up the stairs and around the backside of the building. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get as far away as possible from whatever was in that basement. The sun had started to set, and I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys and finally getting the door open. I jumped in, slammed the door shut, and sped away. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the main road, that I finally started to calm down. I was trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I knew one thing for sure: I was never going back to that schoolhouse. Whatever was in there, it was something that shouldn't have been disturbed. It was a typical Friday night, and I was walking home from my friend Lisa's house. We had spent the evening binge-watching our favorite TV shows and eating way too much junk food. Time had flown by, and before I knew it, it was close to midnight and I needed to get home. I decided to walk home since I only lived a few blocks away. I had done this walk many times before, so I didn't think much of it. Besides, our neighborhood was pretty safe, but tonight felt different. I didn't have a great feeling about walking alone at night. At that moment, I should have made the decision to stay at Lisa's or try to get a ride home. But I thought that I was just being paranoid, so I put on my jacket and started walking home. As I walked, the streets were super quiet. Not a single car drove by, and all the houses seemed to be dark. I thought about taking the main road, but then I remembered the shortcut through the park. It would shave off a good 5 minutes from my walk, and I was tired. The park usually wasn't that creepy, even at night, so I turned and headed towards it. The entrance to the park was covered by tall trees. Their branches were thick enough that it blocked out most of the moonlight. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the path. The gravel crunched under my feet, the sound echoing in the stillness. I kept my head down and walked briskly, eager to get through the park as quickly as possible. The park seemed extra dark with no lights and most of the moonlight being blocked out. A few minutes in, I started hearing noises. At first, it was just the quiet sound of bushes or leaves, which I told myself was probably just the wind. But then I heard footsteps. They were faint but unmistakable, and they seemed to be matching my pace of walking. I glanced over my shoulder, but all I could see was darkness. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the footsteps continued, growing louder and closer. My heart started to pound, and I could feel the adrenaline kicking in. I picked up my pace, walking faster and faster, but the footsteps kept following me. I took another quick glance behind me, and that's when I saw him. A man in a dark hoodie, his face obscured by the hood, was walking about 50 feet behind me. He was moving steadily, not rushing or anything, but there was something super creepy about his presence. Panic set in, and I broke into a run. I was gasping for air as I sprinted down the path. The gravel flew up around my feet, and I could hear the man's footsteps growing faster, pounding behind me. He was chasing after me. The park seemed to stretch on forever, the trees still blocking out most of the moonlight. It was so dark that I could barely see in front of me as I was running. My mind raced, trying to remember how far it was to the other side. I knew I had to get out of the park and find help, but it felt like I was nowhere near the end of the path. I could hear the man getting closer, his footsteps now a rapid pounding in the gravel. Fear gripped me, and I pushed myself harder, my legs and lungs burning with the effort. I spotted the end of the path up ahead, the streetlights just visible through the trees. Relief flooded through me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. Just as I thought I was getting away, the footsteps behind me suddenly stopped. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that the man had vanished. Confusion mixed with my fear, and I slowed down slightly, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what had happened. Had he given up? Was it over? I continued down the path, my eyes frantically looking in the darkness for any sign of him. I reached in my pocket for my phone to call 911, and that's when I saw him again. This time, he was standing 20 feet in front of me. I suddenly stopped right where I was. He was just standing there, blocking my way, his hood still up, hiding his face. I turned and started to run back the way I came, but my foot tripped on something, and I went straight to the ground. Pain shot through my knees and palms as I scraped them against the rough gravel. Before I could get up, I felt his hands grab me from behind.
You shouldn't be walking around in dark parks at night,
he growled, his voice low and menacing. Terror surged through me, and I struggled against his grip, but he was too strong. Desperation set in, and I reached around blindly, my fingers closing around a broken branch or stick. With all the strength I had, I swung it over my shoulder, hitting him square in the head. He let out a grunt of pain and loosened his grip just enough for me to break free. I didn't waste a second. I bolted down the path, my legs pumping as fast as they could. I could hear him cussing behind me, and I knew he was after me again. The park seemed endless, but I forced myself to keep running. I could see the streetlights growing closer, and it gave me strength to run harder. Finally, I burst out of the park and onto the street. I didn't stop running until I reached a gas station a block away. The bright lights and people being around made me feel a little safer. I burst inside, still clutching the branch, and the clerk behind the counter gave me a concerned look. I told him to call the cops as I was trying to catch my breath. He immediately picked up the phone and called 911 without any hesitation. I could hear the sirens in the distance, growing louder as they approached. Within minutes, 2 police officers walked into the gas station and approached me. I told them everything, my voice shaky and my hands still trembling. They took my statement and assured me they would search the park and surrounding area for the man. They also offered to drive me home, which I gratefully accepted. As we drove, I couldn't help but glance out the window, half expecting to see that creepy guy in the hoodie standing in the shadows. The officers walked me to my door and made sure I got inside safely. I thanked them and locked the door behind me, leaning against it as a wave of relief came over me. I was safe, but I couldn't believe what had just happened. You never expect these kinds of things to happen to you. It was a true nightmare, one that I hope I never have to relive. They still haven't caught the guy, and it freaks me out because this happened so close to my house. I still haven't walked alone in the dark since this happened to me, and I probably never will. A few years ago, I took my 5-year-old son, Ethan, to Walmart on a rainy Saturday afternoon. We live in Nashville, Tennessee, and the local Walmart is our usual spot for groceries and household items. I needed to stock up on some essentials, and Ethan, as usual, was excited to come along, mostly because he loved looking at the toy section. We walked through the automatic sliding doors, and Ethan immediately asked if he could go see the toys. I told him no and to stay close, but he pleaded with those big blue eyes. I figured it wouldn't hurt to let him wander a bit as long as he stayed within the aisle I was in. The store wasn't too crowded, and I kept glancing over to check on him. I was browsing the cereal aisle when I noticed Ethan wasn't where I'd last seen him. My heart skipped a beat, and I called out his name. No answer. I quickly moved down the aisle, pushing my cart with one hand and scanning the area. Panic started to set in as I turned the corner and still couldn't see him. I finally spotted him near the end of the toy section, talking to a man I didn't recognize. The man was tall, maybe in his late 40s, and wearing a Walmart uniform. But something was off. The uniform looked different. It was kind of old, a bit faded, and didn't quite match the ones I'd seen all the other employees wearing. I hurried over to them as fast as I could. "Ethan, there you are." I tried to sound calm. "Who is this?" The man looked at me with a slight smile. "Oh, I'm just helping him find a toy," he said. "I'm a store employee." I glanced at his name tag. It read, Steve. But the name tag looked different too, like an old style or something. I knew something was wrong. "I don't think you work here," I said firmly, pulling Ethan close to me. "Of course I do," he insisted, his smile fading. "I'm going to find a real employee," I said, and with that, I walked away quickly, Ethan in tow. As soon as we were out of sight, I found a store associate and explained what had happened. They immediately called security. Minutes later, I saw 2 security guards heading towards the toy section. I followed, and when we got there, the man was gone. The guards started searching the area, and I felt a mixture of fear and frustration. Had I overreacted? Was it all a misunderstanding? Just then, I heard one of the guards on his walkie-talkie. "We've got him near the front entrance." I hurried with Ethan to the front of the store. There, near the exit, was the man, now struggling with the security guards. And there was another child, a little girl, crying and trying to pull away from him. The man had been trying to leave with her. The police were called and the man was taken away. The uniform, the name tag, all of it was fake. He somehow had an old uniform and used it to look legit. I hugged Ethan tightly, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't believe how close I had come to losing him. The store manager and the police praised me for being observant and acting quickly, but all I could think about was how differently the day could have ended. That night, as I tucked Ethan into bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the what-ifs. From that day on, I never let Ethan out of my sight in public places. The world felt a lot less safe, and I learned that sometimes the monsters are real, hiding in plain sight. Last summer, my buddy Owen and I decided to explore an old amusement park that had been shut down for years. We had heard stories about the place, and being the thrill seekers we are, we couldn't resist the temptation to check it out for ourselves. We planned our trip carefully. We knew the park was located about an hour's drive from our hometown, and we wanted to make sure we had enough time to explore before it got too dark. So, one Saturday morning, we packed our backpacks with some snacks, water, and flashlights and hit the road. The drive to the park was uneventful. Owen and I chatted about what we might find, speculating on the possible reasons for the park's closure. Some people said it was because of safety violations, while others believed it was due to financial troubles. Regardless of the reason, the thought of exploring a forgotten amusement park filled us with excitement. As we approached the park, we saw the Ferris wheel in the distance. It was eerie, standing still and silent. The gates were locked, but we found a spot where the gate was slightly open, just enough for us to squeeze through. Stepping inside, the first thing that struck me was the silence. It was so quiet. We walked along what used to be the main pathway, the ground cracked and overgrown with weeds. The rides and attractions, once vibrant and full of life, now stood as rusting relics. We decided to start with the roller coaster, which was one of the park's main attractions back in the day. The track twisted and turned above us, its metal frame covered in rust. We followed the path up to the loading platform, which was now covered in debris. It was strange to think that this place had once been filled with the sounds of screaming riders and the roar of the coaster. As we climbed up onto the platform, I looked around and couldn't believe how run down and dilapidated this place was. It was giving off the creepiest vibe. We moved on to the funhouse next. The entrance was marked by a large, creepy clown face with a gaping mouth. The paint was peeling and the colors had faded, giving it an even more sinister appearance. We cautiously stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The funhouse was a maze of narrow corridors and mirrored walls. The mirrors were cracked and dirty, distorting our reflections in bizarre ways. As we made our way through, I couldn't help but feel disoriented. The air was thick with dust, and every step we took echoed through the empty halls. Suddenly, Owen stopped in his tracks and pointed to the floor. There, among the dust and debris, were fresh footprints. My heart started to race. We weren't alone. We followed the footprints deeper into the funhouse, our curiosity getting the better of us. The prints led us to a room filled with old animatronic figures. They were frozen in place, their lifeless eyes staring at us. I felt creeped out as we carefully navigated the room. Just as we were about to leave, one of the animatronics suddenly jerked to life. It was a clown, its movements stiff and unnatural. Its mouth opened and closed as if it was trying to speak, but no sound came out. We both screamed and bolted out of the funhouse, our hearts pounding in our chests. Once outside, we took a moment to catch our breath. We both kind of laughed at how freaked out we were. I wasn't sure what made those animatronic figures move, but I wasn't going to go back and try to figure it out. Owen suggested we head to the Ferris wheel next, and I reluctantly agreed. The wheel towered above us, its seat swaying gently in the breeze. We decided to climb up one of the support beams with the ladder to get a better view of the park. It was a risky move, but the adrenaline was pumping and we felt invincible. As we reached the top, I looked out over the park. It was a desolate sight. The rides were crumbling and the buildings were falling apart. But then something caught my eye. In the distance near the old bumper cars, I saw a figure. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was definitely a person. We climbed down as quickly as we could and made our way towards the bumper cars. The figure had disappeared by the time we got there, but we found more fresh footprints in the dirt. We followed the footprints to the haunted house, which looked even more decrepit than the other attractions. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung off its hinges. We hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The interior was pitch black, and our flashlights barely cut through the darkness. The air was damp and musty, and I could hear the faint sound of dripping water. We moved cautiously, trying to make as little noise as possible. As we explored the haunted house, we came across rooms filled with old props and decorations. There were fake cobwebs, skeletons, and other spooky items scattered around. It was clear that whoever had been here before us had a taste for creepy stuff. Suddenly, we heard a noise. It was a soft, shuffling sound, like someone moving around in the darkness. We froze, straining our ears to pinpoint the source. The sound grew louder, and we realized it was coming from one of the rooms ahead. We crept forward, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. As we reached the doorway, I took a deep breath and shone my flashlight inside. The beam of light revealed a figure hunched over in the corner, its back turned to us. It was a man, wearing tattered clothes and mumbling to himself. We didn't know what to do. Should we say something to him or quietly back away? Before we could make a decision, the man turned around and yelled,
"What do you want?"
His voice was raspy and desperate. We were too stunned to react at first. The fear in his eyes and the intensity of his voice sent a shock through us. We didn't wait to find out more. We frantically turned around and sprinted out of the haunted house. We made our way back to the main entrance, completely freaked out. As we squeezed through the gate and exited the park, I glanced back one last time and saw the man standing in the distance, his eyes fixed on us. It was a sight that still haunts me to this day. This happened a few years ago. I'm a female and I really don't know why I chose to walk to the store so late. It was a Saturday night and I thought that it would be nice to take a quick walk and get some air. I had to pick up a few things at the store, so I thought, why not? The store was about a mile from my house. It seemed really dark that night, but the walk to the convenience store was quiet and uneventful. Once I got there, I went in and picked up the items I needed and started my journey back. The street was dark, with only a few streetlights lighting up the pavement. The air was cool, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I wasn't scared. I had walked this route many times before. It felt safe and familiar. As I walked, I noticed a figure up ahead, standing under a streetlight. He was looking around like he was lost. I didn't think much of it at first. People get lost all the time, but as I got closer, I could see that he was looking right at me. He was a man maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. He had short, messy hair and wore a dark jacket. Something about him made me feel a little uncomfortable, but I told myself I was being silly. When I was a few steps away, he spoke.
"Excuse me, can you help me?"
He asked. His voice was calm and low. It didn't match the look in his eyes. They were wide and a little too bright, like he was trying to look friendly. I stopped a few feet away from him, keeping a safe distance. "Sure, what do you need?" I asked, trying to sound casual. My heart was starting to beat faster. Talking to this stranger was starting to make me feel extremely nervous. He smiled kind of oddly.
"I'm lost. I'm trying to find my way home,"
he said. He took a step closer, and I instinctively took a step back. Something about the way he moved was off, like he was trying to get closer without me noticing or something. "Where do you live?" I asked, hoping he would just give me an address and I could point him in the right direction. But he didn't. Instead, he took another step closer.
"Can you show me the way?"
he asked, his voice still calm but with a hint of something else like fear or desperation. I shook my head. "I'm not sure where you're trying to go. Maybe you should call someone to come get you," I suggested, my eyes looking around for any signs of other people. The street was empty. He took another step closer, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest.
"I don't have a phone,"
he said.
"Please, I just need some help."
Something in his voice made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I knew I had to get away from him. "I'm sorry, I can't help you," I said, taking a step back and turning to walk away. Suddenly, he grabbed my arm. His grip was strong, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest.
"Please don't go,"
he said, his voice low and urgent. I pulled my arm free and started to walk faster. My mind was racing. I could hear his footsteps behind me, getting closer. I didn't dare look back. I just kept walking really, really fast.
"Wait,"
he called out, his voice echoing in the empty street.
"I just need your help."
I broke into a run, my feet pounding the pavement as I sprinted down the street. I could hear him running after me, his footsteps heavy and fast. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from this creep. I turned down a side street, hoping to lose him. The street was even darker, with only a couple of street lamps lit up. I could hear him getting closer. I could literally hear his hard breathing behind me. I saw a house with a light on and I ran up to the door, banging on it frantically. "Help! Someone please help me!" I shouted, my voice shaking with fear. The door opened and an elderly woman stood there, her eyes wide with surprise.
"What's going on?"
she asked, looking past me to the dark street. "Please let me in. Someone's chasing me," I begged, as I was looking around for any sign of the man. She stepped aside and I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me. I could hear his footsteps stop outside and then silence. I held my breath waiting. The woman looked at me with concern.
"Are you okay? Who was that?"
she asked. I shook my head, trying to catch my breath. "I don't know. He said he was lost, but something was off about him," I said, my voice trembling. She nodded and led me to the living room, where I collapsed onto the couch.
"You're safe now,"
she said.
"We'll call the police."
The rest of the night was a blur. The police came and took my statement, but the guy was long gone. They said they would look for him, but I wasn't feeling confident that they would actually find him. I never found out who he was or what he wanted. The whole situation was definitely sketchy, but I knew I had been lucky. If I hadn't run when I did, I might not be here to tell this story. I worked at this Walmart in Indiana for about 3 years. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it paid the bills and kept me busy. I worked in the electronics department, helping customers find the latest gadgets and setting up displays. One day, a new worker named Jessica introduced herself to me. She was friendly, with a big smile, and seemed genuinely nice. "Hi, I'm Jessica," she said, holding out her hand. "Hey, I'm Mark," I replied, shaking her hand briefly. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another coworker being polite. Over the next few weeks, Jessica tried to make small talk with me whenever she could. She was nice, but I always was so focused on work that I didn't pay much attention to it. One day, she asked me out for coffee. "Hey Mark," she said, catching me as I was stocking shelves. "Do you want to grab a coffee sometime? There's a nice little place down the street." I was caught off guard but didn't want to be rude. Sure, I guess," I said, scratching the back of my head. "When?" "How about after work today?" she suggested, her eyes lighting up. Okay, see you then," I replied with a small smile. We met up at a local coffee shop after our shift. The place was cozy, with warm lighting and the rich smell of freshly brewed coffee. We chatted for a while, but I could tell that this wasn't what I wanted. She was nice, but we weren't really compatible like that. I decided to end it early. "I'm sorry, Jessica, but I have to leave," I said, standing up abruptly. "I'll see you tomorrow at work." Over the next few days, I noticed Jessica was trying to get closer to me. Whenever I tried to avoid her, she seemed to find a way to talk to me. It was getting frustrating, so I decided to be upfront with her the next day at work. "Jessica, coffee the other day was cool and all, but I'm not interested in anything more than a friendship." She seemed to take it well. "Oh, okay, I understand," she said, trying to sound casual, but I could see the hurt in her eyes. That's when things started to get weird. One night, after work, I found a deep scratch along the side of my car. I was furious. "Who the hell did this to my car?" I shouted to myself in the parking lot. As the weeks went on, I started to notice Jessica watching me from a distance. She kept leaving notes in my locker. Every time I would throw them away without even looking at them. One day, I had had enough. "Jessica, this has to stop," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "If you don't leave me alone, I'm going to report you to HR." She looked scared, but I hoped that would be the end of it. That night, I found my tires slashed. I was at my breaking point. I couldn't take this anymore. The next day, I went into work and talked to my manager and HR about what was happening, and they reviewed the security footage. They had clear evidence of Jessica scratching my car and slashing my tires. She was fired on the spot and told to leave the premises immediately. As she walked out of the store, I felt a mix of relief and pity. How had things gotten so out of control? I decided not to call the police and press charges. All I wanted was to do my job and live my life in peace, but instead I had been dragged into this nightmare. I realized then that Jessica needed help, but it was out of my hands. My only concern was moving on and putting this whole ordeal behind me. I've always been a sucker for creepy adventures. When my cousin Will and our friend Landon suggested we explore the old abandoned mental asylum on the outskirts of town, I was all in. It sounded like the perfect way to spend a chilly winter night. Little did I know, this would be a night I'd never forget. We met up at my place around dusk. I grabbed a flashlight and we headed out in Will's beat-up old Jeep. The drive to the asylum was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel really creeped out. We parked a little way down the road, not wanting to draw any attention. I could already feel the goosebumps rising on my arms as we made our way to the entrance. The place was massive, looming against the darkening sky like some kind of gothic nightmare. The main building was flanked by two smaller wings, and the whole thing was surrounded by a rusting iron fence. We found a spot where the fence had been bent back, just wide enough for us to squeeze through. The inside of the asylum was just as creepy as the outside. The walls were covered in peeling paint and graffiti, and broken glass crunched under our feet. It was clear that we weren't the first people to come here looking for a thrill. We made our way down the main hallway, our flashlights barely lighting up the area. We started in the reception area, where a dusty old desk and a shattered computer monitor sat. There were papers strewn everywhere, some of them yellowed with age. I picked one up and tried to read it, but it was too faded. It didn't matter though. We weren't here for the paperwork. We were here for the scares. We wandered through the halls, peeking into rooms as we went. Most of them were empty, but a few had old rusted beds and other pieces of forgotten furniture. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mold and decay was almost overpowering. It felt like the walls were closing in on us, like the building itself was trying to keep us here. As we ventured deeper into the asylum, the temperature seemed to drop. It was already a chilly night, but in here, it felt like we were walking through a freezer. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and kept moving, trying to ignore the feeling of unease that was growing in the pit of my stomach. We eventually found our way to the basement. The stairs creaked under our weight, and I half expected them to give way at any moment. The basement was even darker and creepier than the rest of the asylum. Our flashlights barely seemed to penetrate the thick, dark blackness. Down there we found the old boiler room. It was filled with rusted pipes and machinery, all covered in a thick layer of dust. It looked like no one had been down here in decades. We wandered around, poking at things and trying to see if we could find anything interesting. That's when we heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, barely audible over the creaking and groaning of the old building. But as we listened, it grew louder. It was a sort of whispering, like someone speaking just out of earshot. We all froze, our flashlights darting around the room, trying to find the source of the noise.
Do you hear that?
Will whispered, his voice trembling slightly.
Yeah,
I replied, trying to keep my own voice steady.
Where's it coming from?
We stood there for a few minutes, straining to hear. The whispering continued, growing louder and more distinct. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere deeper in the basement. Without a word, we all started moving toward the sound, our footsteps echoing in the dark. We found a narrow hallway that led off from the boiler room. It was even darker and more claustrophobic than the rest of the basement. The whispering grew louder as we made our way down the hall, our flashlights flickering slightly. At the end of the hall, we found a door. It was old and heavy, with a small barred window near the top. The whispering was definitely coming from behind it. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pushed the door open. Inside, we found a small room, barely bigger than a closet. The walls were covered in strange symbols and markings, drawn in what looked like dried blood. In the center of the room was a small wooden chair, and sitting in the chair was a doll. It was old and ragged, with button eyes and a stitched mouth. The whispering stopped as soon as we entered the room. The sudden silence was almost deafening. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at the doll. There was something deeply unsettling about it, something that made my skin crawl. Landon stepped forward, his flashlight trained on the doll. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, reaching out to touch it. Before he could, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. We all jumped, spinning around to face the door. It was shut tight, and no matter how hard we pushed, it wouldn't budge. Panic started to set in. The room felt like it was closing in on us, the air growing thicker and harder to breathe. The symbols on the walls seemed to writhe and twist, almost as if they were alive. The doll remained motionless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us. We were trapped. The whispering started up again, louder this time, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from all around us, filling the small room with the sound of evil voices. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands slick with sweat. Then, without warning, the doll's eyes opened. They weren't button eyes anymore. They were real, and they were staring right at me. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. I could feel the room closing in, the walls pressing against me. In a blind panic, I grabbed the doll and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a thud, and the whispering stopped. The room was silent again, but the sense of unease remained. We needed to get out of there, and fast. With a surge of adrenaline, we started pounding on the door, shouting for help. We knew it was unlikely anyone would hear us, but we had to try. After what felt like forever, the door finally creaked open, and we stumbled out into the hallway. We didn't stop running until we were back outside, gasping for breath and covered in sweat. The cold night air was a welcome relief after the stifling confines of the asylum. We didn't say a word as we climbed back into the Jeep and drove away, the asylum receding into the darkness behind us. None of us could explain what had happened, and we didn't want to try. All I know is that something in that asylum didn't want us there, and we were lucky to get out when we did. I've had my fill of creepy adventures since then. Some things are better left alone, and that asylum is definitely one of them. I'll never forget the night it happened. I had stayed late at work to finish a project. By the time I left the office, it was past midnight. My office is downtown, which is usually busy, but it was pretty quiet at that time of night. I live close enough to walk to and from work, about a 15-minute walk. The weather was cool and the streets were empty. The only sound was the wind blowing and the occasional passing car. As I started my walk home, I was feeling a little paranoid from the eerie quietness. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination. I had always been a bit jumpy, especially after watching horror movies. The prior weekend I watched The Conjuring with some friends, so I figured it was just residual fear. I kept walking, trying to focus on getting home. The street lights weren't very bright, making the night seem even darker. I walked past the closed shops, their windows dark. I told myself to keep calm, that there was nothing to be afraid of. About 10 minutes into my walk, I noticed a car driving slowly behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's a quiet neighborhood, and sometimes people drive slowly when they're looking for an address. But as I kept walking, the car continued to follow at the same slow pace. I glanced over my shoulder, trying to get a better look. It was an old beat-up sedan with tinted windows, making it impossible to see who was inside. I picked up my pace a little, hoping the car would just pass me by. But it didn't. It stayed right behind me, moving at the same speed. I was feeling a little nervous at this point, but I told myself to stay calm, that it was probably just a coincidence. Maybe the driver was lost or waiting for someone. I decided to turn at the next corner, taking a slightly longer route home, just to see if the car would follow. As I turned the corner, I took another glance back. My heart started beating so fast when I saw the car make the turn as well. still following me. Now I was really starting to freak out. I knew I needed to get somewhere safe, but my mind was racing and I couldn't think clearly. I remembered that there was a 24-hour convenience store a few blocks ahead. I figured if I could just make it there, I'd be safe. I started walking faster, almost jogging now. The car kept pace, its engine a low rumble in the quiet night. When I was about a block away from the store, the car suddenly sped up and pulled up alongside me. The passenger window rolled down, and I could see a man inside. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes.
Hey, need a ride?
He called out, his voice gruff and unfriendly. I shook my head and kept walking, not even bothering to respond. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins. The car slowed down to match my pace again, and the man continued to watch me. I was almost at the store when the car sped up again, this time pulling over to the curb right in front of me. The man got out and leaned against the car, almost blocking my path. He was tall and stocky, and there was something really creepy about the way he stood there, casually waiting for me.
Come on, just get in the car,
He said, a creepy smile spreading across his face.
It's not safe to walk alone at night.
Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I felt paralyzed with fear. I forced myself to keep moving, my eyes locked on the bright lights of the convenience store just a few yards away. The man took a step towards me, and I bolted, sprinting the last stretch to the store. I burst through the doors, breathless and terrified. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked up in surprise.
Are you okay?
She asked, concern in her voice.
There's a man outside,
I panted, pointing towards the door. He's been following me. She immediately came around the counter and locked the door, then picked up the phone to call the police. I watched from the window as the man stood by his car for a moment, then got back in and drove off, disappearing into the night. The police arrived a few minutes later and they took my statement, but I knew the chances of them finding the man were slim to none. I thanked the cashier for her help and waited for the officer who offered to drive me home. After this incident, I've never walked to work again, and I've had serious anxiety about walking alone, even in the daylight. You never know when something like this could happen to you.